Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 4 p.m. work session for Lynchburg City Council. And first on our agenda today is to receive a report on the downtown loading zone pilot program. And Ms. Hart and Mr. Malowitz will be presenting. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Everybody making it all dry? Yeah, it's a rough one out there. All right, well, thank you for being here today. We're going to report out on the loading zone pilot program that we initiated back in the beginning of June. It was something that we had discussed at council and PDC up to the May 14th approval of City Council that we initiated a loading zone pilot program where we changed the fees for parking in loading zones, changed the fee for parking in the street with the whole purpose of better managing our loading zone activities so that we could get vehicles in safely, create a safer environment for our pedestrians and our traffic downtown. So the purpose of this is to provide you with the results of that pilot program, our successes, our challenges that we faced, and give you a broader overview and recommendation of where we ended up with it. We'll talk a little bit about our public outreach efforts, what we did in terms of getting to the businesses, getting to the delivery drivers. We'll look at the overall assessment, again, challenges, successes, and what we feel went great for that. And then we'll finish it off with our recommendation as city staff and what the next steps that we plan to do moving forward. So again, the loading zone pilot program area, in case some of you have forgotten, it's been a little while. This was the map that we included as part of our communication outreach. But we pretty much just hit Main Street right here, from the 800 block of Bowen all the way down to the 1300 block where the old grocery store was and Farm and Seed is. We did another all-day loading zone here on Commerce Street to help facilitate some of the anticipated deliveries that occur on 900 block of Main Street, primarily due to the heavy restaurant presence in that area. So what was our definition of success? When we went into this program, we wanted to define what this looks like. We wanted to ensure the safe designation, enforcement, and use of our loading zones so that deliveries could get in there appropriately. They could make efficient deliveries without blocking traffic, and that would effectively make it safer for our vehicles traveling down Main Street and pedestrians trying to cross the street so that there wasn't any traffic barriers in that area. Again, improving public safety. And then we also made it our due diligence to try to respond to all the concerns from the businesses. We wanted to be very open and honest and transparent about this program, but also be responsive to all the inquiries and questions that came from local businesses and as well as the delivery drivers. So, what was one of our biggest successes of this program? Deliveries still occurred. People were still able to get downtown. They were still able to get to their destinations. Delivery drivers are still able to access points of delivery zones and get the product to the businesses. Businesses still receive their product. Everything went great and as far as that went. We created parking spaces for the large delivery trucks. That was a concern in the beginning of the project is, okay, well, how do we facilitate semi-trucks getting here? We know that we can do UPS, FedEx, excuse me, and other cars, but we needed to know how we can make sure the delivery trucks could get in there. We wanted the delivery trucks parking lanes of traffic to reduce. We did that by creating those zones. They weren't parking in there when they could park in a larger extended loading zone on the street rather than in the street. Our flyers that we did helped to educate not only the businesses and the public, but also the delivery drivers. We printed a number of those throughout the program and gave them out like candy pretty much. We wanted to make sure that people were educated about the program, they had the information that they needed to know, and they were also able to go to alternative parking areas. Our least concern was issuing citations of any form. We wanted to make sure people got it. Issuance was the last step of the process. Businesses and the delivery companies were very communicative through this entire process, which was great. They spoke openly with enforcement staff. They called me when they needed to. We talked at length with different delivery companies to make sure that they understood it, that the communication was being delivered to the delivery drivers. We had very few issues outside the 900 block. As mentioned earlier, we anticipated some issues in the 900 block given the capacity that it was experiencing. A lot of deliveries all at once throughout the day, so we knew that that was going to be an area that we'd have to really watch. So outside the 900 block, we had very few issues. We still had good deliveries even when the Midtown Deck project started to come about. We were able to create the loading zones, make sure they were available and cars weren't parking them while the construction was getting to go underway. We also created that clear line of sight that I mentioned earlier too. By having those delivery trucks off the street and into the loading zones, people were no longer jockeying around lanes of traffic and trying to get around vehicles. They could easily see down the road. They knew what was ahead of them. They didn't have to worry about coming around a delivery truck and there possibly be a pedestrian crossing a crosswalk at that point. They could see what was ahead of them, able to anticipate it and make corrections as needed. So that was a big one for us too. That's that whole safety component that we were looking at with these loading zones. Our public outreach was, again, flyers. We worked with the communications and marketing department, developed these flyers, got these out to as many people as we could. We did a couple others throughout the program, kind of changed it up a little bit. Most of it was the same information, but there's things we wanted to highlight, so we made sure to adjust it and remind people when this pilot was happening, how long it would be. Then we also used these citation notices. We printed these out, we put them inside envelopes, so if we had to issue a citation or a warning or whatever we were doing, we were slipping that inside the envelope as well. So as folks got that, they got the information. We just also issued it out just to anybody too. So it didn't have to go in a citation if we ran out of the flyers or they weren't easily accessible because they were back at the office. Officers had them in their cargo pocket. They just pulled them out and said, well, here you go, here's the information, here's where the different zones are. Businesses helped out. We were very impressed with the business involvement. What you see behind me is 2 examples of businesses that posted information on their front door so they could alert customers of what was happening and give them the same information that they're getting, which was very helpful in maintaining consistent messaging throughout the program so nobody was confused or got wrong information. Everybody was getting the same. We made a couple of adjustments. So while we had a lot of successes, there were some challenges along the ways, but our responses to those were swift. We worked with the business, we worked with the delivery company to maintain open communication and that we could make those adjustments. What you see here is one that we made in the 1000 block. So this is where the Shules is. And what we did here is we heard from a business that the loading zone was just too small. This is the one that's right at the corner of 11th Street and goes right in front of the front door of Shules. Well, no large truck can really fit there. I mean, you got Benny's that's in that block. You got another business that's opening up and they're getting cabinets and whatnot delivered. So we worked with them and we actually moved this loading zone to where this pole is right here. And that essentially added 2 more parking spaces and it can now fit a semi-truck in there where they can make that delivery from the corner. So it's easier to access for the delivery companies as they're coming in. They just swoop right into that corner spot, stop, make their delivery and move on. Our second adjustment was on the 1200 block of Main Street. This is where White Hart Coffee is, McCraw Furniture, and Hip Tulip, and a couple other businesses. Previously, what we did is there was one singular loading zone right in front of McCraw Furniture and the White Hart. We extended that loading zone to the corner to 12th Street, and that was a 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., and then it reverted back to the 1 hour parking from 11 to 5. And it just wasn't working out well for the deliveries at White Hart. We were still seeing trucks park in the lane of traffic. Then we had another business owner that came to us and said, hey guys, I have a large delivery that happens at least twice a month. They can't fit in those spots. And they come in at 2 or 3 o'clock just because of scheduling and delivery times. There's no way they can make it there in the morning. So we went and spoke with the rest of the businesses in that block, proposed this loading zone down here at the corner. Everybody was very positive about it. Everybody loved it. Hip Tulip especially because of the floral business. A lot of people coming in and out, so she was really excited to have a loading zone right in front of her store. So now that loading zone basically starts, well, here's the ending. 13th Street is right here, and it runs all the way up to Hip Tulip by Bailey Spencer. And that's been very successful, not only for that block with delivery trucks, but also any large delivery trucks in the previous block, that 1400 block where Farm and Seed is and the old grocery store was. Trucks can now, again, because similar to Shules, they can come in, access that corner spot, and get in there with little problems and get out no problem. One of our final adjustments relates to the one that I just previously discussed. We had this loading zone on 13th Street, and we just found that it just was not being utilized. Folks, it had no real business that it was there to accommodate. The other businesses, the Beeswax place and Moyann's, they all get their deliveries in different areas or from FedEx and UPS, so they're able to use the already existing loading zone or 15-minute parking. So we just eliminated this completely, and we actually just made it the 2-hour parking, which has been highly receptive. The residents in the area love it because now they can get in there, they can stay there a little longer, and it's not as difficult for the large trucks to access because that loading zone's now on Main Street. So product can still be delivered from this corner into this building or wherever they need to go down a block. These are some of the examples of our success, what we found. I've got a lot of pictures actually, and I've got some very good time lapse, which is funny. But for brevity purposes, here's some of the highlights. As you can see, 2 semi-trucks here in the 900 block, parking there, making their delivery. Both off the street, not one of them is in the street, clear of traffic. We got 2 different trucks here making successful deliveries in the 900 block. And if you recall earlier in the discussion, this was one of our problem areas. So for us watching the loading zones and going through this was a big win. This was, got to take a picture, got to get that documented. Here's a good picture of different types of use. So we've got single vehicle occupancy folks that are sitting there just unloading whatever some product into one of these businesses. We got the regular size delivery vans able to make deliveries. And we got some of the larger ones. But you can see here where we've got a mixed use of parking, still occupying a loading zone, but still being accessible for normal public parkers coming down for business or to patronize one of the businesses. This didn't go without its challenges. While we saw a lot of successes just now, we did have a couple of challenges that came up. We saw that some delivery trucks were still parked in the lane of traffic if the loading zone was unavailable. So while they did their best to utilize those loading zones, there were times when those loading zones just weren't available, mostly because people parked there to do whatever they wanted. A lot of it wasn't loading or unloading, it was just they parked there for their purposes. So they would generally park in the lane of traffic. Those 7 to 11 a.m. signs that we tried, they were mostly ineffective. There was too much words. People complained that there was too much to read. They weren't taking the time to read it. They were just generally getting confused. And because of the confusion, they just gave up, parked there, and waited to see what happened. So we received a lot of phone calls and questions about that. In those cases, we would generally reduce the ticket to a warning and simply as an education time. And hey, this is what it means. And once we explained it, people got it. But it took that one-on-one communication, not only in the office, but also for enforcement staff. The majority of our delivery trucks arrive after 10 a.m., what we found out. There's only one that actually can get here before 10. The other delivery trucks, like the larger Cisco, Coca-Cola, the Budweiser trucks, because of scheduling out of Roanoke or other parts of not Lynchburg, they just can't get here before that time. By the time they load a truck, they get on the road and get here to Lynchburg, they're coming in 10 o'clock, sometimes a little after 10 o'clock. So that's where that 7 to 11 really didn't help with them because they're already outside getting there right before it ended or right after it ended. The 900 block, as I said, it required a lot of attention. We really focused a lot on that block. But again, that block had that mix. It had that 7 a.m. to 11, and then the 11 to 5 parking, and then it had another all-day loading zone across the street. So there were a lot of signage happening. There was a lot of activity happening. So we did maintain a good presence throughout the entire pilot program to hopefully get our messaging across, make sure people understood what they could and couldn't do. Here's the examples of some of the challenges. As I stated earlier, this is the signage problem. That's what a lot of people complained about. So, and we worked hard at that. We met on a few occasions and said, all right, how can we make this better? What options do we have? And sticking with our MUTCD standards for signage in the downtown, this is what we had available to us other than adding more signs. So something that we continually investigated and still tried to work with throughout the program. But as you can see, that it can be a little confusing to folks. Here's an example of trucks still parking in the lane of traffic. With this one in the upper left, generally what we found was there was a car, usually one car there, and they would pull away after the delivery started to happen. So you saw someone, what looked like them just stopping, it wasn't, it was because a car was there. The Coca-Cola distributors, they were very open and communicated with me about those issues. They said that was their biggest challenge is when they came in that they did have cars there often. So we responded and made sure that we became more of a presence in the 900 block. This one down here is just an example of a delivery driver who the spaces were full and didn't really know what to do or where to go or what was going on. So he just parked where he wanted to park and made his delivery. I actually was first on scene on that one and worked with that gentleman and helped him out to understand that the Commerce Street loading zone is the alternative parking. We did surveys. We had a midway survey and we had an ending survey. Approximately 40 of those went out to both the businesses and the delivery companies. We only received 9 respondents for the first and 8 for the second. Not a lot. We were hoping for a better response, but we didn't get it. A lot of our responses did come from that one-on-one activity that we had with the businesses and the delivery companies and folks just coming in or calling. But overall, the response were 50-50, for and against. Folks gave their opinions that they didn't think it was working, others thought it worked great. So we weighted that as appropriate, as well as all the other respondents that we received just from the other methods that I spoke of. Our overall assessment, program's working. We're dramatically seeing a reduction in the use of the lane of traffic. They're going into the loading zones. The deliveries are happening in those designated loading zones, and we're seeing safer traffic patterns. Cars aren't, again, as earlier stated, they're not trying to jockey around delivery companies, or we're not seeing those queues that we saw before because somebody might not have been able to get around because another car beat them to the area. So we're not seeing that as much anymore. The businesses and delivery companies are now more aware of the loading zones and what their alternate loading zones are. Again, especially the 900 block. If that loading zone is full or occupied, they know to go around now to the Commerce Street loading zone, and we were able to create a walking path through the bottom level of the Midtown parking deck so they can load their carts up, walk through the Midtown, hit the elevator, and they're up to the 900 block. And they have used it. Mixed reactions, some positive, some negative, mostly just because they got to walk more. But they'll make the deliveries. They understand they still got to make the delivery, and that's what they're there for. So they get it done. We did note that the all-day loading zones work a whole lot better than the 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. And again, that's just because with the 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., it's just a lot of words and a lot of signage right there, especially when you're driving down and you're trying to read and pay attention. Am I on a one-way? Am I on a two-way? The standard issues that you see. We responded very diligently to any complaints or any issues that we had. Myself and the rest of the city staff team that were working on this loading zone pilot program, we made sure that we listened to them. We made sure that if we had any questions, we got together before we issued out how we were going to deal with the situation. As noted earlier, of how we made different adjustments throughout the pilot. That wasn't just a singular decision. That was a team effort when we got together and decided, okay, well, how can we best facilitate this? The delivery drivers definitely appreciate these larger zones. It makes their life a lot easier, so they really enjoy it. We use enforcement to help educate on rules and uses of loading zones. As noted earlier, citation was the last step that we wanted to take. We did take it when necessary, but we were out there to make sure folks really knew what was going on, why we're doing this, what the alternate parking is, and how they can better navigate throughout downtown and use these zones for their purposes. So, because we saw all these great successes of what was happening in our different use and designation of loading zones, we felt very strongly that this is a great program. And we knew from the beginning in going in and proposing this all to you that we had a deficiency in how we were managing our loading zones. So we wanted this program to showcase how we could better manage those through the use of better signage. And that's where you got the 30-minute, where we're clear on the violation amount. That was a big key part of it too, and also adhering to what judges had recommended that we do. So given all the successes that came out of this program, we feel very confident that this is something we should continue to implement through the rest of the Central Business District, continue to work with downtown business owners and delivery companies, and see where this is more successful. So today, we're here to recommend that this continue on, that the ordinance amendments that were made during the May 14th City Council meeting continue, and then we will take those and continue to work with the successes from this program to, again, develop better loading zone practices and procedures throughout the entire Central Business District. That is my next steps. We'll work with DLA and the Communications and Marketing Department to create a better communications plan, a robust one that we can get out effectively to business owners and delivery companies so that, again, they have a clear understanding of where they can go to make their deliveries and how to make those deliveries successful, as well as if they have any issues, who to contact. And a big piece of the puzzle when we started this program was making sure that all of our loading zones are consistent. We knew we got some inconsistency in signage around town. We want to wrap that all together and have all that signs consistent so folks that are coming downtown know it's a loading zone and know how to use it and don't abuse it, and make sure that it's there available for the folks that have to use it to get deliveries made. In closing, are there any questions?
Thank you for such a thorough report. Any questions? Councilmember Wilder?
Thank you for the presentation. Is very helpful. And I'm glad the project is working. There's one question that was posed to me about the parking on Commerce Street, the loading zone. Is that clearly marked, and also that pathway, is it lit? Or some comment was given to me about the pathway from that parking on the loading zone on Commerce Street.
The pathway, it's lit as well as the lighting is in the parking deck. So we've got LED lights in the bottom level there. And they're decent. It's not, as I'm assuming what you're saying is like a clear delineation lighted pathway. It's not. We've got the reflective striping down, so that you can see where it is. But
And also in reference to the construction, how does the construction on Main Street affect all the loading zone, and how does that affect the changes?
The construction really didn't affect us so much. We ended the pilot right before Main Street construction started, but as it was getting underway, the deliveries were still happening and adjusting. The construction team took away was some of the lessons that they learned from ours is, again, having clear, easy access to loading zones. So when they created the loading zones that you see today, like on 9th Street and 10th Street, some of the lessons that were drawn from the pilot were incorporated into how they decided where that would go to and how they would work that.
So with some of the construction, some of the lanes being closed, I don't know some size of it, so that didn't affect the loading zones that you currently have established?
Well, on 900 block, they're gone. In the 900 block Main Street, so that's why, in essence, they were affected because we had to move them. So we moved what was previously in front of Market at Main to 9th Street and 10th Street. Am I in the right path?
Yes, that's what I was thinking about.
Okay.
So I guess we've communicated that with the drivers and things of that nature about the traffic and the construction and where the new sites are?
Correct, yeah. The construction team for that Main Street renewal project took even some of the contacts that we had gotten from the pilot, and they reached out to all those individuals and made sure they knew it as well, where to go.
Okay.
So we kind of teamed up on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Malowich. That was a good presentation, and I really do appreciate that you have touched on all of the elements, the signage, the communication, the education, what the private businesses are doing, what the city did with regard to the flyers and public media notices and so forth. We certainly need the entire community to be more enlightened about what the possibilities are and what challenges we have, and not stick in our old practices and habits.
That's right.
I do want to comment on what you just addressed, and that dealt with the construction downtown by somebody, whether it was a city or APCO, pretty much coincided with the beginning of the pilot program. And my observations were that throughout the pilot program, there was some construction going on some portion of either Church, Main, or Commerce Street. Mm-hmm. And you have positively and optimistically concluded that that really didn't affect what you were doing. But I would somewhat politely challenge that, in as much as I think since we have 2 one-way streets downtown, any obstruction or activity on one-way street is going to cause traffic to move to some place that they're not going to have to encounter that obstruction, which would indirectly affect what's happening on the other 2 streets. So to have a good scientific empirical test of how much one affects the other, I don't think it can be done as long as there's construction going on downtown because of the effect of the overflow and redirection. But I think it's good that we've learned a great deal from the pilot program, and it's commendable that you've learned from what obstacles you encountered, that you've been listening to the businesses and made adjustments to that, and already you're seeing some positive outcomes. You didn't say it directly, but I assume your recommendation is that council not make any decisions with regard to going forward with two-way traffic at this time, but simply allow the pilot program to continue while the construction is going on until we get to a point that there's no more construction and we can have a legitimately pure test of whether it really works. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we did it not in thinking of it as a two-way, but we initiated the pilot program not in conjunction with two-way, but separate of it. It got kind of put together a little bit later. Our whole focus when we initially started the pilot program is that we knew that we had issues with our loading zones. So we wanted to address those loading zones. Two-way happened to become part of the discussion later on during the presentations. But my recommendation is, regardless of two-way traffic, whether it happens or it doesn't happen, what we've done with this pilot and the changes in the ordinances that you all have voted and said that we should do has dramatically helped us with how we manage our loading zones, whether it's in a one or two-way configuration. The all-day loading zone that's on Commerce Street, that's in two-way, and it worked great. We just understand that we need to expand that out into the rest of the downtown, and having these ordinance changes, we'll put that in a two-way configuration on Jefferson Street, where we're seeing an increase in vehicle or traffic, getting those semi-trucks off the street and into some of those designated parking spaces so that those cars can pass through that tighter area a little better. I would recommend, that regardless of, again, what happens with two-way happens with two-way, we just know and we feel confident that these changes in the loading zone practices are what has to happen. It just has to continue to happen to make sure that we can keep consistent practices and make sure that our businesses that are coming in, both old and new, have that opportunity to get products successfully and keep our streets safe, both vehicle-wise and for our pedestrians.
Okay, thank you. And
You're welcome.
I asked that and I said that because I don't know how many people have asked me, well, you all decided back in the spring that you're going with two-way. That's what it's going to be. And of course, the answer was, we don't know yet what we need to do. We've got to solve the loading zone issue, because if we can't get it right with one-way, it's never going to work with two-way. So to establish a reliable system, at least in a one-way, makes a two-way possible. But at this point, so there's no confusion as to where we are today and in the near future, we are not talking about two-way traffic. We're trying to perfect a one-way traffic and get the loading zones right. That's what you're.
Yes.
That's what you're
Yep.
saying. You want us
Loading
to do.
zones in one-way or two-way, because we had it in both during the pilot. Down on 13th and Main was two-way in our Commerce Street. So yes, loading zones need to happen and be better at how we enforce and regulate those regardless of the direction of traffic.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Good work.
I think one thing we should point out also, as far as construction goes, we mentioned the AEP construction during the pilot project, but also remember that the Midtown deck was also closed, or a significant portion of it was closed for a significant amount of time. So that put a lot more parking potentially out on the street, which really made this a more complicated project as well. So definitely agree that it was not in a vacuum, but I think it's important to note that parking was pushed out as well.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate all the departments working together to get it done in an environment that had so many challenges to it. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Wright?
Thanks for the presentation. Just so I'm clear, this is a recommendation to leave the ordinances as is, and then the city staff could go out and expand loading zones throughout the central business district and work with, business partners to do that. You don't need to come back to us for any kind of approval in that regard.
No, you are correct. Yeah, we made the changes at the May 14th meeting, so we're set.
So it's only if we had strenuous objection today
Right.
would you all not do that?
Correct.
I see, okay, great.
And I think we would ask for your affirmative approval to continue forward in the direction we're going. The ordinance has changed, and we don't need to take any action there, but we would like a conversation and an affirmative action to say, we're going to continue forward in this way rather than revert back.
And in our last budget, did we include an appropriation for two-way on Church Street?
We did in the CIP and in the downtown projects.
And then Main was included in the Main Street renewal, is
That's
that
right.
right?
So there's money appropriated, and so we, as Mr. Malowitz said, we would not suggest that this conversation be connected with two-way traffic. And we have some time with respect to two-way traffic on Main Street before that final decision needs to be made. I would suggest it might need to be made sooner than a long period of time after construction, because we need to make sure we're designed correctly, whichever way we go. But that we have some time before that needs to be
That'll
done.
be brought back
Yeah.
to council to discuss. To Councilmember Nelson's point, we wanted to identify that the loading zones would actually work before we implemented two-way. Thank you.
Any further questions? Councilmember Pero?
Thank you. Councilman, I think I heard Councilmember Wright say expansion of loading zones. You're not planning to expand any more loading zones. This is the ordinance, so
When you say expanding, can you clarify?
you said expansion, didn't you?
I was just responding, being responsive to what I thought Mr. Mounds was saying, that this was a pilot program in sort of the core of the central business district, and that you all might, depending on what the need is, expand that out to other streets within the central business
Yes,
district.
correct. Yeah. So like, for instance, Jefferson Street. You know, we know we have some issues down on Jefferson Street with trucks delivering to Water Dog and Maylands and some of the other businesses. We were waiting for this pilot to wrap up to see what we learned from it, to how we could react to what's going on in Jefferson Street. And we've definitely taken some points that we've learned from here that we're going to hopefully work with Jefferson Street businesses on and see what we can do to better accommodate them.
Certainly think it's advisable to learn from the pilot project. My primary concern, or one of my concerns, I guess, is still the parking count, the on-street parking count, and making sure that that's still a good, viable number. According to the report, you are +1, I guess, is what I saw, but I don't think that's really, because you gained 3 spots on 13th Street, but you lost 2, it looked like, 2 on Main. But you also lost more than that, because by expanding the loading zones beyond 11 o'clock, you lose those 3 slots in those 2 loading zones. So that's like losing an additional 3 slots. So I'm just highly concerned about the number of spaces that remain available for use. So thinking about that, and I appreciate your flexibility and the way you've adapted to the need. I think that's important that we as municipal government can adapt to business and work around business. So I'm hoping that we can do that even further on some of these loading zones that are all day. I love the fact that people are actually using them for drop in, drop out type stuff, which is great. I've told you in the past, I got a dirty look and a talking to from one of the parking ambassadors once for being in a loading zone and dropping off something in front. This is before the pilot project and before the additional education about the proper use of loading zones occurred. So I'm assuming that's not happening anymore. That's great. We just need to be careful about that window. The larger loading zones for trucks, I think that's seems to be working out well. If we could I don't know, you're the parking expert. How do we narrow that window? So if no trucks are showing up before 10 o'clock, then maybe it's 2-hour parking up to 9? Or, well, maybe that we can allow more front-end parking, and then maybe it's just a window during the middle of the day that has all the trucks, and you leave a space or 2 for the last whole day, or maybe one of them gets shut down, the other one stays open for parking. But what this amounts to, I understand, is a ton of signs potentially, and you're trying to avoid that, which brings me to my last point. And I am so deep in the weeds, I can't see anything on this one. The sign that you showed up there, you were correct. That sign was awful. Too much writing and so forth. But what really got me and confused me, and I hope you're probably doing this now, but I would hope if you've got 2 signs next to each other that the arrows would be going opposite directions, with the primary designation on the top, and there's an alternate designation, then that would be on the bottom. That would make a whole lot better sense to me if it was a double sign, they had alternate approving arrows. So, like I said, that's down the weeds. So, anything you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I'm sorry, excuse me. Yeah, we are working on that with Lee, our city engineer, and Gaynell, and our sign shop. We're looking at, okay, do we make a longer sign rather than the standard that you see? So we're trying to look at, okay, if we still need that information in there, and it's good information, and it helps retain on-street parking spaces for as long as we can, how do we just better communicate it? And just given the short time frame of the pilot program, we got the information that we needed. Now we got more time to sit down and really dig into that and figure out how we can better communicate.
What concerns do you have about shortening the window on the loading zones?
You mean just doing 7 to 11?
Well, or 9 to 2?
It'd just be, how do we communicate that? We can definitely do that and accommodate the trucks that do come in during that time, but just making sure we don't repeat this process and how to get that there so that we can still give public parking after and before those times, but making sure we're clear that drivers that aren't familiar with it can read it legibly, understand it quickly, and make a decision expediently either to park there if they think they're going to get a ticket, or know that they're going to get a ticket if they park there and find a better spot. So.
being able to access the businesses for loading purposes, and the semi-trucks are nice, those are specific for large deliveries. I can see during the rest of the day where UPS or FedEx or parcel deliveries or other forms of parcel deliveries are being made. I think that's great. It requires a much smaller spot. My primary focus, again, is how do we maximize on-street parking and make that available to the public. Last question, and you kind of answered this, how much use is that Commerce Street spot actually getting?
It was getting quite a bit during the pilot, and especially back to the construction point, once 9th Street closed, and when 9th Street from Main to Commerce was inaccessible, and the delivery trucks are coming in, that's where they were going. So they were using it quite often. And then we had our project at the Midtown parking deck that was going on, so the contractors that were doing that project were able to use that spot quite frequently when they had deliveries of different product and that we were using. So we're seeing good use of it. I think it's successful. It's a good alternative. Because again, 900 block just gets so chocked full with vehicles every once in a while that having that alternative loading zone down there conveniently located, and then they can just go right up the elevator, works out really good.
So I guess the preferred route for, say, a Coca-Cola truck, an articulated Coca-Cola truck, coming through, realizes the 900 block is full, they can't access it. So their preferred route, I guess, would be going all the way up to 5th Street and coming down and then back to Commerce to see if the Commerce Street is open.
Some are doing that. Some were doing 7th Street.
Can they turn 7th Street?
Yeah, that's actually wide enough.
Okay.
They got to creep over into the lane a little bit, but 7th Street is wide enough for them to get down, and once they get down, they can still make that swoop onto Commerce Street. So most of them are using the 7th Street. I didn't
so they're
see
figuring it out.
Yeah, I didn't see any Bravehearts try 5th Street, or not 5th, I'm sorry, try 8th, because 8th's a little tighter. So I didn't see anybody do that. I'm sure there were some that did.
But as we go into this construction, you're going to see the streets getting tighter. It's going to be harder and harder for those turning movements to be made. Just a quick comment. I'm on Church Street frequently some mornings, and the parking it's just full with there are more and more apartments are happening on Church Street, and you see a lot of parking spaces taken. But when we come out of the housing authority meeting, that loading zone's pretty clear. So it looks like people are following the rules anyway, or your ambassadors are enforcing very nicely.
Yeah, they're doing a good job.
So thank you, Ms. Melvitz.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Councilmember Wilder.
Just one last point. I know this morning I did see a commercial advertising that downtown was still open, and it spotlighted some of the businesses that are in a construction zone. I thought that was really helpful, just to let the community know that you can still get to those businesses. It's also spotlighting the businesses that are downtown. So I thought that was helpful. I don't know if it was the Business Association or which group sponsored that.
Yeah.
Which group sponsored that?
Yeah, it's the Downtown Lynchburg Association. They've done an amazing job, and they helped us out as well throughout our loading zone pilot program. We had them in the room too. Ashley was present in our meetings, and really helped us make those connections, especially when we didn't know who to talk to at a business. It was Ashley, who do we talk to? So thank you. They were a huge part of our team effort as well.
So I thought that was helpful because I know the communications would be so crucial during this time, during the construction, during all the changes and things. So I thought that was helpful to kind of put out there. Yes, thank you.
All right, no more questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Malowitz. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you to all the departments that have been working on it. So, did you get what you needed from us?
Is it possible to do just an affirmative action to direct staff to continue forward in the direction we're going?
Okay, so based on the recommendation, I think we have the general approval. Yes.
Okay.
Everyone is for moving forward.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you. Next, we have a presentation by Davenport and Company, LLC, regarding finance plan for capital improvement plan, and Ms. Witt will give us the first of this presentation.
Actually, David Rose is here with Davenport, and he will be making a presentation. The first one's going to be regarding our plan of finance strategy. If you give me those, I can pass them out.
I was going to say one. Yep, I'm
Yep.
good. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of council. I'm David Rose, again with Davenport. Pleased to be in front of you all again. What you should have in front of you is a handout that we're going to address this afternoon on capital planning needs, and Donna has graciously indicated she's going to keep changing the slides. So if I go too slow, she'll change them and I'll have to catch up. So if you would just turn to the first page, background. Let's see, I think you're ready.
Oh, I've got the wrong one up.
You get the wrong one up? Okay. We've got a couple different presentations today.
There we go.
Okay. So first page should be page 1, background. All righty. Again, I think all of you know we've had the good fortune of being your financial advisor for some time now, and again, very much appreciate that. In doing all that, you have, of course, your ongoing multi-year capital program, and we have worked with you over the last several years to refine that and to try to make sure that it was done in the most cost-effective manner and made sense, particularly in light of interest rate environment and other considerations. So that second bullet point there, we talk about you have a roughly $125 million bonding program over the fiscal years 20 to 25. That's nothing new, nothing has changed. But what has changed, again, is some of the nature of the overall interest rate environment. I think a year ago at this time, we were thinking rates were going to be moving up, and they were. We were hearing from the Federal Reserve that they wanted to raise rates some 3 or 4 times in the subsequent 12 months. After raising them a couple of times, they did an about face. And of course, we are today much lower than we were basically a year ago at this time, and you'll see that. In addition, you can see there the $26 million, the Lakeside Drive Bridge at the College Lake. That has taken on a great deal of certainty, and of course I will pass along some of that to Donna and to Reed to elaborate as necessary. But what we do know is that that project has a certainty to it, a time frame that's very definable, and that frankly, that is something we want to recommend moving forward with now while rates are so favorable. In addition, the just-in-time approach that we started a couple of years ago really has been working for us. It's a program where we don't do the average capital project way in advance like you had been doing, because frankly, a lot of those dollars were causing us to pay debt service too soon. We weren't able to earn particularly good interest rates to offset that when the money was sitting there. And so this line of credit approach, or just-in-time approach, has really worked very nicely for us. So with all of that said, on the next page, I mentioned the interest rates and what they have done, and I do think graphically it almost speaks for itself. On the left-hand side, we go back to 2000, so basically almost 20 years, and rates have just basically moved downward over 20 years. But then if you look at the right-hand side, we look at what they have done literally over basically a 20 plus, 24, 30-month period, and they have dropped considerably from where they were moving upwards just essentially about a year ago. So with that happening, with this really the nadir, if you would, of from 1980, and by the way, 2000, had we gone back to even 1980, when I started in this business 20 years earlier than that, rates were even higher. So we really are at or hitting 50-year lows in interest rates. So all of that's part of why we're here today, to take advantage of those interest rates while you're in a very good shape. So what we'd like to recommend, the plan of finance, if you would, is here we are. It's now basically towards the end of the calendar year, middle of the fiscal year, and we have a line of credit, your initial line of credit, that we did in June of 2018, and that will expire this coming June. So basically, before we know it, that's going to expire. What we are going to recommend is that we renew and create a new line of credit for a couple of years, because again, it has served us well. But what we've got to do, the way it's structured, is any of those drawdowns that we have done or plan to do over the next basically 8 or 9 months, we have to term them out. That's what we always plan to do, meaning convert to permanent financing. So think of it this way. If you're fortunate to build a home and you start with a construction loan for what might be 8 or 9 months or a year, you do that as you draw it down. Then when you're done, when the construction is over, you term that out to 30 years. We're talking about doing the very same thing, only we're talking about doing it roughly 20 or 22 years, paying it faster than we might do a construction and permanent loan for a home. So that said, we've already drawn down about $2 million, but you plan on drawing down an additional $16 million over the next 8 or 9 months, and we'll talk about that. So the idea is to term that out sooner rather than later, as well as combine that with the Lakeside Drive Bridge, which is $26 million. So collectively, we're going to talk about doing $44 million by the end of this calendar year, as opposed to waiting until effectively next June. And the reason for that is really the last bullet point, and that is when we started talking to you about the terming out of these pieces of projects, we used an interest rate of 4.5% to term out those projects. Today, we are looking at an interest rate at around 2.5% to term out those projects. We've got another handout here that shows a sensitivity analysis of the benefits to doing this right now at 2.5% versus waiting, if you would, upwards of a year or two, or even the first piece is 9 months, and the savings is somewhere north of $10 million of interest. So from our perspective, it's highly compelling working with staff that we lock in interest rates that are known, that help you not only with absolute interest rate savings, but also don't require you to have to put a whole lot more dollars into debt service sooner rather than later as part of the budgeting that Donna and Reed and Bonnie have to do when they come to see you next spring for 2021's fiscal year. Okay, let me see some water if I could, please. So, if you go to the next page, I indicated, sorry, thanks, okay. If we go to the next page, page 4, I indicated we're talking about moving quicker to do that $44 million. And want to make the important point here, we are not talking about doing any more dollars than was part of your $125 million plan. We're just talking about the pace of which and the timing of that. That's the only difference. So with that said, I mentioned the $18 million, which is the $2 million already drawn down, another $16 million that's planned over the next 8 or 9 or so months, plus the $26 million, moving that up, which is the Lakeside Drive. What I'm also going to show you in the next few moments is what that means to all of your debt ratios and everything else that we care about, which is making sure that your hard-earned credit ratings are in no way compromised, and that's another point. So on the next page, this is now the new recommendations, if you would, timings of the financings, if you would. So the first column going across, and you don't really see the shading as well as maybe you see it in your handout there, but the general and school CIP projects, that's the 18 I was alluding to. And then you can see what you have in subsequent years based upon, again, all of that should add up to roughly $125 million. And then you can see the Lakeside Drive is there of the $26 million. And then you'll see to years 21, 22, 23, there's brackets around it. What that's basically saying is, instead of waiting to do those over the next 3 years, we're going to recommend they do it now. Again, the idea is the bird in hand, 2.5% versus who knows what things could move to. And then lastly, the totals, and they lump together, that 44 million would go right to permanent financing. The other 3 years, 21, 22, 23, we'd continue to use the strategy of the line of credit and take it out then in fiscal year 23. That leads you to ask the question possibly, is it possible that if rates continue to look so good after 21 or 22, we could do the same thing? That answer is yes. We might entertain that as well. And then finally, 24, 25 fiscal years, you could see where those are. Those are big numbers. And again, that would be in another line of credit, and that's why they're set up this way. So nothing different than we first talked about in June of 2018, but the difference is that we are recommending moving now versus waiting till around June to even do the 18 million, and then again, coming up with the 26 now while we know that rates are so favorable. So I've got a couple more pages here, but so far is everyone, am I going too fast or too slow, Madam Mayor? Okay. 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 All righty. So what we wanted to do on page 6 is just to break down what you saw on the previous page, what those look like in terms of those 3 borrowing amounts, the terming of it, the interest rates that we're using for the next couple of pages. And so what we did was for that 44 million that I've been talking about and that we're recommending, our new interest rate range is about 2.5%, again, as opposed to the 4.5%. However, for the next 2 series of borrowings, we have assumed, once again, that it could be at 4.5%. So we've tried to be conservative here and not assume that those 2.5% rates stay. If they do, this whole plan looks that much better. But we've purposely assumed they don't stay that way. Now, what has changed? Because we're recommending that we, in effect, move up and speed up the College Lake project, we're going to recommend that this project be financed over 22 years versus our normal takeout of 20 years. And again, that's because a good portion of it we're speeding up versus doing it 2 or 3 years from now. We've run sensitivity analysis on what that either costs or saves the city, and what it turns out, interestingly enough, is it's a break even. We're no worse off if we were to do that now and do it over 22 years versus wait 2 more years and do it 2 years later. And that's because we're able to do a couple of things. Number one, we're able to reinvest the money at almost the interest rate that we're borrowing at, if not even possibly a little better, but we've not counted that. And what we mean by that is the state has a program, which we've used before here at the city, called the State Non-Arbitrage Program. Fancy name, been around about 30 years. We've used it all the time, and it's run by the State Treasurer's Office. When we take in that money, if we do the 44 million, we will basically immediately invest that through the state program, and all those monies like you and Roanoke and other cities, it's only for borrowed money. It's all, that's a special program. And right now, the earnings on that, it's overnight monies. It's treasuries, United States treasuries, is earning about 2.3%. So the earnings on that, which change every day, are almost akin to what we think will be your borrowing rate at roughly 2.5%. Frankly, if we were to enter the marketplace today, our 2.5% would be lower. I'll just tell you, we did Montgomery County last week, and Montgomery County last week did 20 years, actually did 22 years, and their borrowing rate was 2.22% fixed rate. So we've just used a 2.5% rate. I will tell you there's no reason why we would be any different than Montgomery County, but the markets change every single day. So again, we try to put that in. It doesn't mean we'll be at 2.5%. We might be higher, might be lower, but it's an order of magnitude versus the 4.5%. Having said that, Madam Mayor and members of council, if you give us the green light to do this, and rates start to move against us quickly, there's no requirement that we move forward. We just have to have the amount that's drawn down done by next June. And then the 26 million could always go back to the old way of doing it. So that's important to realize as well. Having said all that, we've got the cash flows here on page 7. Whole lot to digest, but we wanted you to see purposely how much you pay right now in your existing tax-supported debt. In the fiscal year 2020, you pay about $17.8 million in debt service. That's what's baked into the 2020 budget. And by doing this, on the far right-hand side, when we add in those middle columns, which is all the borrowings, what you find is that next year we go from 17.8 to about 19 million, and we basically kind of crest somewhere in about $19.5 million. That is considerably better than when we first started working with you. No, we started working with you many, many years ago, but when we started talking about the just-in-time program, we actually thought we would actually have to come up with $2 or $3 million more in the very early fiscal years. This, you're going to see in a moment, is a lot less onerous on your budgets. So that is something that gives Donna and Reed and Bonnie a lot of comfort coming into the 21 fiscal year that y'all are going to talk about, obviously, fairly shortly. So if I could, let me just show you on page 8 exactly how many more dollars we need, and to tell you how these numbers differ a little bit from the previous page. If you look at page 8, and that's really the relevant page, you'll notice that in 2020, Donna, and she can elaborate on this, you'll see there that number on debt service is $18,111,000. That's the way she budgets and gets it set up, okay? She builds in some conservatism. So if this program is allowed by y'all and we move forward at a 2.5% rate, next year we will need roughly, that far right-hand side, we'll need about $350,000 more to move forward with our overall debt service. And then we need a few other pieces over the next decade, if you would. And that's assuming that the rates pop up to 4.5%. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but the idea here is we've been thinking about this not just for what it does for 1 year, but what it does for the entire continuum of your debt and your profile. So you can see on the right-hand side, what effectively is happening is we have taken, by virtue of the just-in-time strategy, combined with good interest rates, favorable reinvestment rates, all of which we know, and so the additional dollars needed over the next 5 to 7 to 8 years can very well mean less than $1 million for doing $125 million of capital projects. That's really the takeaway, is that by strategically and smartly doing all this, and you all setting up this just-in-time program, and us following through and tweaking it here, we're able to basically weather $125 million by what is roughly maybe $1 million more of dollars committed for debt service over the next 6, 7, 8 years. And again, it's an estimate because those second phases of borrowing are assuming 4.5% as opposed to 2.5 or 3 or whatever. Now, that leads to the last point, and that is, could it be higher than 4.5%? Yes, it could. So that would tweak some of these numbers, and they move a little higher in subsequent years, but not in the early years. So I hope I haven't overdone it, but on the next couple pages, 9 and 10, we wanted you to see what your ratios, your debt ratios look like versus your policy. And you can see on page 9, your policy says you will not broach 4.5%. That's not 4.5% interest rate. That is your overall debt to the overall assessed value, the taxable assessed value of the city won't go above 4.5%. So here you see, you stay within that, you stay comfortably under that, you hit your high water mark at 2024, but again, you're well within your policy. And I think that's the important thing here, is that you still have a very solid cushion, and that's with your $125 million being added in. And then lastly, on page 10, this is your credit card, debt service to expenditures, and yours says you're not going to spend more than 10 cents of every dollar on debt service. So again, if you liken it to your credit card at home, if you have one, you're saying, I'm not going to spend more than 10 cents for every dollar. You are basically sub 8 cents on the dollar, and you stay that way, if not getting better, over that period of time. So again, it's one of the reasons the rating agencies highly rate you. It's one of the reasons they'll look kindly on you. And again, we don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. So this plan keeps us in that mode. Lastly, on page 11 is just a time schedule. If indeed you provide us this blessing, we will move forward the balance here of the month of October in November. We will interact with the rating agencies, and then we're hopeful that at the December 10th council meeting, if indeed that's still happening, we would have a public hearing, because anytime you do new money, you have to have a public hearing. You all know that. Be advertised accordingly in the months of November into December. And then our thought is to basically sell these bonds, again, if conditions hold, sometime in early, mid-January. And if not, then we won't sell them. We'll wait, or we'll talk to you further, and we'll move forward by the end of June, as we have to do. We don't know what the future is. I'm not able to tell you that we know this can happen, but we do feel good about it. The world is very volatile, as you know. And I've seen 10 weeks of periods of time back in April of 1987, between April of 87 and June 15th of 87. I remember we lost 2.5 percentage points. Said another way, if I was talking to you about 2.5%, the market ended up at 5% 10 weeks later. A few months later, we had the market crash, stock market. So the bond market crashed a few months ahead of time. Who knows? I don't want to scare anybody. It's not my job. I do wear a dark suit. You know, it's kind of become somber. But anyway, having said that, I do feel like we've got a good window. And I've never tried to be greedy about trying to get the absolute lowest interest rates. I just feel like this is an intelligent time to think about that. And I'm happy to answer any questions. So, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Rose. We have questions? Councilmember Pero.
Thank you. Mr. Rose, thank you for your analysis. Very much appreciate you stepping through it. So what is our our current line of credit rate? Is that about 4.5? I know that's what you have in the estimates, but what is our current rate?
Oh, our interest rate right now on our line of credit? No. It is,
I don't know.
but we know that, we've got that down pat, and I want to get it. I mean, like, I live with it. We talk about it. Hold on. Do you have our old presentation?
I don't know.
All right, I did not bring that. It is, our line of credit right now is very solid. It's in the 2 range, 2% range. Yeah.
Okay. So if it's in the 2 range, so and then we're going at 2.5.
Well, or
Permanent
something like that,
financing.
yes.
Right, estimated for permanent financing. I'm struggling to understand how you're going to get, if we accelerate that borrowing, so we are going to increase the amount of borrowing, we're going to accelerate it, and we're maybe paying an equal or maybe a slightly higher rate when the permanent financing comes in.
So here's why. That's a very good
I'd like
question.
to see that other document that you have to understand that maybe.
So while Don is handing that out, so think of it this way. That current line of credit, it ends in June. It ends in June. So no matter what, we've got to come back to you in early winter, early spring, and take out permanently the $18 million. because that's how
You
the,
gotta do the 18 anyway.
what's that?
You've got to do the
Got to
18 anyway.
Anyway, that's exactly right.
So you might as well roll on the 26.
That's the idea, yes, sir.
Okay.
So the difference in the sensitivity analysis shows if we can roll in the 26 at, again, 2.5% versus what was thought of historically in the planning at 4.5%, we're a whole lot better. That's
Great.
really what it's about.
Historically, being a presidential election year coming up, don't rates tend to go down?
Well, they do, and so it's interesting. So this is the year, actually, it's typically, and just like the stock market, likewise, tends to do better in that third year before the actual, we'll call it the election year. That's typically, you see both those effects. But I'm not an economist, because having said that, as we were heading into the third year, last November, okay, they were planning to see interest rates go up. That didn't happen. So we've seen the interest rates go down, which is more typical. But yet they were still forecasting, the Fed and everyone, that it was going to do the opposite of what normally happens in a pre-election year. Now, the actual election year itself, it's kind of a grab bag. I can remember, going back, it shows my age, that's why I've got no hair, and overweight, because I can remember when George Bush was looking to be reelected and then Jimmy Carter came in. In 92, in came, of course, Bill Clinton. That whole year was really a disaster for Bush, and that was, but then it turned around literally within a few weeks. So it's really, I'm not an economist, I was a chemist, so I can't
And
speak
I'm not a financial consultant, so,
Yeah.
but you all predict this stuff, you all know the patterns better than I do, or can interpret the patterns better than I can.
But I
So
will say
you
this.
think this is the right time?
I
based on
do,
that?
I do because, well, but let me say this, this is something important. We don't, as your advisor, try to predict, that's because we're not, even if I was an economist, that's, economists are wonderful 20/20 hindsight, so that's not what we're trying to do. All we're trying to do is to say, we had a goal and an objective when we started all this a few years ago, and that was to minimize debt service, not exacerbate your ratios, to help the overall cash flows for the city. And this right now is a moment in time, like you said, we got to do the 18 anyhow. I'll be back in front of you if y'all say no within 3 or 4 months anyway, if not sooner. So our thinking is, why not get the economies of scale and not be greedy, if you would, and say if we have used 4.5% as an assumption, and we're now closer to 2.5%, it just seems to make sense to us. That's really, and you know what, Mr. Barrow? We could be wrong. And if we're wrong, we said to ourselves, you know what? If the city's paying 2.5 or 2.75%, there's two things to say. Number one, we can always refinance. We have the ability, this will be able to be refinanced, not immediately, but it can be refinanced over time, like we've done other finances for you, to lower rates. But does it feel bad in the grander scheme of things to say we've locked in money at 2.7% versus historical averages, which are north of 4.5%? That's the point. And that's where I'm saying, I'm not an economist, but I feel okay about it after 40 years.
2.5 is great, and even for a tax-free muni, which I'm assuming,
It is,
like
yes,
you said, AAA tax-free muni, that's quite nice. All right. So doing quick math, unless I'm really messed up here, on page 5, I came up with $175 million.
Which analysis?
Oh, sorry, I haven't even looked at the sensitivity analysis
Okay,
yet.
sensitive, okay, so let's go.
So I'm in your, no, I have not looked at the sensitivity analysis. I'm in the primary slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Page 5, yeah. I think I came up with 175,000, which is the 44, where'd I get 50? 44 plus, excuse me, I did this too fast. Let me do this again. It's 31, not 51. That's going to make a big difference.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out what our total borrowing was over that past term, which I was summing up the blue box, the green box, and the yellow circle. So in round numbers, that's going to be 125. Oh, that's much better. That negated my question, because as I was looking on page 7, the aggregate principal of new borrowings, I was trying to figure out where the rest of the principal was, but it adds up. So that makes much better sense
That makes
now.
me feel better. No, I'm kidding.
But what I don't like about this is 5 years, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of interest-only payments. And I'm assuming, Ms. Witt, that's specifically because we're trying to hold our debt service to be a flat at the time. All right.
And that's why, but I like your question, and I tell you why. That's why we put the sensitivity analysis together. Because the sensitivity analysis shows that by doing like that delayed principal, okay, because we're speeding up the permanent, we're delaying the principal and just doing interest. That's why when you look at this, I think you'll feel equally good, Mr. Parrow, and hopefully you will, because it shows that by doing this approach versus having principal paid faster, it actually is a break even. It's no different.
If it's a break, it's a break even based on the I need to look at this, obviously,
Yeah,
based on the 4.5% that was projected, or break even?
No, it's based on, you'll see this here.
Okay, then I'll look.
You'll like it. It's based on the 2.5.
And it's because we wouldn't be paying any more than what we're paying on the line of interest,
Okay.
Yes. So it's based on the 2.5,
or line of
yes.
credit.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
All right.
It's apples to apples. Yes, sir.
All right, so,
Yeah. Do we have
so
that
we'll
page?
get everything paid off then in
Now, this is the
2046, but I know
sensitivity. Am I
we'll
going back to
continue
the
to
other?
borrow because we always do.
Okay, here we go.
Just
So-
for everyone's benefit, Mr. Barrow,
Yes,
as I
sir.
said, Madam Mayor, you could see up there, recommended approach, alternative scenario 1 is the weighting, is doing it the normal way, if you would, okay? And you can see there, the planning rate, we use 2.5 for hours. And then the other approach, by not doing that approach of delaying that principal we talked about, we use 2.5% as well. Bless you. See that? We use
Yes, sir.
2.5%.
Okay. Okay, I'll just, sorry, I'll need to get my head in that. I'm not as quick as you guys are.
No, we can come back, we're so slower.
Just last observation, this plays out on the graph on page 8, but I'm looking at page 7 still. The total debt service really stays constant until, really, you will see it start trending down in 34, 35 or so, and that's,
Which, are you back on?
well, 31, I guess.
Presentation?
Which presentation?
I'm sorry, I'm the one that I read in advance. The
Okay.
capital needs plan of finance.
Okay, let me get to that. Hold on. And what page then, Ms. Barrow?
I'm looking at page 7 of
Okay, we get
the
that.
total debt service
All
amount.
right, Donna's gonna get there, I'm gonna get there. Okay, hold on. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, so,
And page 8 might be easier, because graphically, and it shows you, it's
Yeah.
both the same.
well, it's, okay, we can look at the graph instead. What that tells me is without increasing revenues, there can be no more debt service added until 2031 or so.
That's right, that's correct. So here's the way to think about this.
And what we've projected out is 2026, so that's basically a 5-year window where unless we increase revenues, we're not going to be able to
Right.
have anything in our capital plan.
So, that's right. So when we started working with you, and I started working with you, I don't know how many years ago, 17, 18 or something like that, you, just like when we did Heritage High School, we knew we had to start putting extra dollars away and had a plan. Well, now, what you've got by virtue of all this is basically your next 5 or 6 years are spoken for, meaning you can see effectively it's about flat. So what you now have to say to yourself is, okay, after the next 5 or 6 years, as we start thinking about 2027, 2028 into 31, there will most likely be extra dollars that we're going to have to start putting forward. We, if all things being equal, the just-in-time amount, and that approach allows us to have to put less dollars added to that. Now, this also presupposes that there's no refundings that could happen between now and then, and all of that. Because if we have some refundings, interest rates come down, so that line that looks like it's going a little higher here can actually go a little further down. Because again, I've made higher interest rate assumptions on the back end of that debt.
Right.
And that hasn't changed, meaning the assumption. So we'll see. And also, I've made the assumption, working with staff, that borrowings happen all within the 5 or 6 years. You've never really been that way as a city in the last 20 years. And Donna, that's the beauty of us having been together so long. We know the patterns of, even when you do major projects like Heritage. So with all that being said, this project, if we were to come, when I was in front of y'all multiple times when we showed what additional dollars we thought we need for the first 125 million, we were talking about having to add, in the short run, a couple $3 million. And now we're coming to you saying we don't need a couple $3 million anymore. So,
More like 1.1 or so.
but 1.1 over like 7 or 8 years, we
Yes.
were looking at literally $3 million in the first year or two.
So that's a tremendous improvement.
Very, very big difference. And, you know, again, maybe even more. Yes, sir.
I think a point to make to council is, I mean, you see it in black and white on, well, excuse me, in green and blue on page 8. You know, so the capital improvement plan is set, at least the dollars are. The project's not necessarily. It's based on certain projects, but future councils are not going to have the ability to add additional projects to the capital plan without taking out something or increasing revenues, and locked in for years. So just so you all see that and are aware of it. And my last question, I'm sorry for taking up so much time. And Ms. Witt, you just hit on this already. I was just going to ask, is there, at 2.5%, is there ability to refinance any of our older debt at this? Is it worthwhile or not?
We look at that often, but the IRS and the General Assembly took away our ability to advance refund any of the debt.
I don't understand what that means.
Take it out before it's callable. So that kind of limited us in what we can do. So we until something is callable, we can't take it out. So, but we watch it
We do. There's
really
some
closely.
exceptions to all of that, but we monitor that. And I would love to be able to come back next month and say, you know what, we have found, because we monitor every month. I'd love to be able to come back, Mr. Barrow, and say, something as an opportunity has opened up. And that could happen. If it does, it'll only make the numbers better, because what we have historically done with you is when we refinance for savings purposes, we don't extend the final maturity. We just simply do what we call a match maturity. So if something is going to be due, let's say a piece of debt, a bond is due in 2033, and it's at 5%, we're only coming to you because we can then do it at 4% and be maturing same 2033. So that would be, I'd like to come back to you, let me say that. Now, there is one thing I would add to what Donna said. Since we cannot, as they call it, advance refund before this call date, a lot of jargon, what we can do is, because the taxable world has changed, it's two worlds, taxable, tax exempt. We as local government, we can borrow tax exempt, but we as individuals have no ability to borrow tax exempt. It's just the way the government works. The taxable world has been very favorable. Sometimes things get refunded with taxable bonds. It's not typical, it's not usual, but it's been happening. So again, we may come back to you. I'd like to come back to you, let me say that.
Yes, sir. All right. Okay, I think that, is there I don't see I was just looking for, I've got, would you mind providing counsel when you have time, just kind of what is our gross or our aggregate interest rate? So if you look at all our funding, what is our interest rate on I guess aggregate, or I'm not sure how you'd phrase that. But I mean, are we running at 4.5%? Are we running at 3%? It'd just be interesting to know.
Oh, I see. You know, what's your overall rate?
What's our overall rate?
Okay, we can, well, there's a couple ways to look at that, but we could look at that, sure.
Okay.
We'll make a note.
And if it's a real challenge to answer that question, don't worry about it. Maybe then it becomes like kind of a list, but maybe that's an CAFR anyway.
We'll get you an answer.
All right. Is there a motion that goes with this? I didn't see anything on the thing. So this is just, you're advising us, there's no action to be taken. And we're not going to provide feedback or guidance as whether you prefer, because you said, tell me no, I'm gonna go away right there, I'm gonna go away.
We need to know if you're okay with us moving forward. There's a whole lot of work that has to happen before we can go to the bond market. So
Okay.
we need to know if you're okay, if we pursue this. You would have to make a definite decision when we have the public hearing, but we need to know if we're okay to start moving forward.
Madam Mayor, I have no objection to moving forward whatsoever.
All right, thank you. I don't see that anyone else has. Councilmember Nelson, did you have some comments
Thank you, Madam
or
Mayor. I
questions?
did. In Finance Committee today, we had some fairly positive information concerning projected revenues and unassigned fund balances. I don't know if Mr. Rose is aware of how the city stands right now about that, but my question would be, it looked like there's about $11 million more in the unassigned fund balance than was projected. Is that correct? We projected
Yes.
18, and it's somewhere around 29.
But not all of that will be available for paygo. We go through some
Right.
pretty specific calculations. But we are seeing more than what we thought would be available for paygo.
And then the revenues were budgeted or estimated very conservatively, and it looks like that came back to be about 4.3 million more than we had estimated.
But that's part of your unassigned fund balance.
Right.
So,
How does that positive information weigh into dealing with the years, in the next 2 years, when we may have to come up with that million plus that we don't currently have that's being shown by these graphs? Can we set that aside and, as Mr. Rose said, save it like we did with Heritage in anticipation of using it those times?
and we'll be reviewing the 21 through 26 CIP to see what our paygo needs are. And if we can figure out how to prioritize that, it may be that it's worth setting some of that aside for the future, for other projects, or it might be that we can free up some other money by using our paygo differently for other projects so that we don't borrow as much
Right.
or put as much on the next line of credit. So we'll look at that to strategically to see how we can best utilize that money.
Okay, so the bottom line, that information will play into these calculations.
Yes, absolutely.
So I just want to remind you, when we restructured CIP last year about this time, in our plan, which is what these numbers are based on, when we sort of rearranged everything that we did. One of the things we knew and we talked about at the time was that we were going to have to put aside additional money in those upcoming years. And some of the way because the way we projected the debt, but also because of our sort of cash payment projects that we knew, whether it was going to be paygo or some of the operating money that we're setting aside towards these projects. So those still exist, and so we'll have to put the debt numbers into those calculations, so it will be slightly different when we actually get to the budget process for actually how much money we'll need over the next several years. But if you remember, we planned in that conversation to be putting away extra money each year to be able to fund CIP, so that we knew that when we hit the end of that time period, we were going to have some capacity to take on some additional debt as well. So really good points to make.
Okay, so for the audience who may be listening or watching, when you say paygo, that's an abbreviation for pay as you go?
That's right.
Cash.
Which can only be used by our rules and policies and procedures for one-time projects or items.
That's correct.
Okay, I just wanted that to be clear. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I don't think there were any further questions from Councilmember Wilder.
Again, just thank you for the presentation, also for explaining all of this. I know it's very, it's such a voluminous task in financing all the projects that we're doing, and thank you for presenting this in an understandable manner. We really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I know you said you're not an economist.
What's that, ma'am?
You said you're not an economist. I understand
No, I'm
that.
definitely not an economist.
But how does the bond rating agencies look if we are changing and then the economy goes south, or?
Okay, so that's something I can address. So that's really not and that's good. Luckily, it's not an economics question. It really is one about the rating agencies, and that leads us into sort of our next presentation,
Okay.
which is adequate fund balance and all of that. So if I could, I'm going to answer that,
Go right ahead.
Mayor, with this next handout. We've got also on the screen.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing the sensitivity analysis. Based on my quick look at it, yeah, it looks like a good recommendation. Thank you for that.
Yeah, again, just to add to Councilman Perry, you know, my perspective as your advisor, I just want to try to get the best facts that we can show you. It's you know, I'm not biased one way or another. That's how we look at it. You know, it's not like we're creating for you should go borrow 120. You've made the decision. That's what you need to do. You know,
Yes, sir.
now it's for us to help you do it most intelligently, smartly, you know, affordably. That's how we look at it.
And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we look and
Yeah.
truth
Right, and that's
test as
part of
best
why we
can.
show the ratios. So, for example, if you are, forget affordability and cash flow, if all of a sudden you said we have $250 million of needs, that would blow all those ratios, you know, and that would go back to hurting credit ratings. That would cost you interest rate costs. So aside from the cash flow, that would make Donna stay up all night worrying about how to pay for it, you know. Okay.
All right.
Actually, it'd probably make her go run away and retire as fast as she could.
We don't want
We
that.
had that.
No. Okay, so Madam Mayor, if I could, we were asked to talk about your fund balance policy, review your existing policy, which is a solid one. It's a solid one. It's kept you in good stead. But also, is there some recommendations that we as advisor have? And this is where it comes to answering your question that you broached, if I understood it correctly, just a few moments ago. And that is, how do the rating agencies look at some of these things? Well, what we're talking about for the audience is, for a city of the size and complexity of Lynchburg, we have credit ratings from all three of the national credit rating agencies. They are private, independent companies. We have no ties to any of them. They are all effectively located, headquartered in New York. We don't get to pick and choose. And they are, again, the three agencies that review local governments throughout the country. During the financial crisis, they were beaten up pretty badly because in the corporate side of what they did, they completely missed the mark with particularly housing-related debts. However, in the world that we're in, meaning the local government side, they were spot on. They actually did a very good job, and they identified some real weak problems, places like Illinois, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico. They were right about all those. So the rating agencies, while they may be one agency, they're called agencies, meaning each one of them, may be getting in trouble, and they've even gotten sued by the federal government. In the world of local government, what we care about, they are very highly reviewed. They're very critical to investors, because what they are basically is what they designate for you as your credit rating has a direct impact on what an investor out there will demand as an interest rate. So here you are on page 1, and you are actually rated in a category one step away from AAA, which is the highest. And if the three agencies, you're right there one step away, called AA+. And then with Moody's, you're AA2, 2 steps away from being what we call AAA. So that is considered, on the right-hand side, the tier is called very strong. That's not my terminology. That's theirs. That's not me telling you that's what it is. So you're in anything above that dark line that says Baa3, BBB-, all of that and above is considered investment grade. Anything below that, there's 5 tiers, is junk bonds. Okay, so you can see where you are. Effectively, if there's 10 tiers, you're in tier number 2, and you're at the top of or the equal to the middle of tier number 2. You're in good shape. So, comes back to what do the rating agencies look at? So if you go to this next page, on page 2, the most important element these days for rating agencies, not the level of debt that you have outstanding, it happens to be your unassigned fund balance. Another way of saying your rainy day fund. It's monies that you have that aren't going to cash payments of anything. They're dollars that are there for emergencies. There's dollars that are there for cash flow purposes, because as Donna will tell you, and as y'all know because you're experts now in your budgets, you don't have the same dollars coming in every month as they go out. That's the way local governments are. So you have to have some fund balances to help so you don't have to do short-term borrowing to pay your bills. So right now, it's 10% of general fund revenues. That's what it is. It's a solid number, but we're going to make a recommendation that you move to 15%. Okay, that's what we're going to recommend. Now, let's go to page 3. You can see visually, not counting 2019, Councilman Nelson, because again, we were not privy to that. Using 2018 audited numbers, you can see there that you've been healthy above that 10% policy. Having said that, we also think that we should memorialize that. But we also know, and you asked about this, I think, Mayor, what do the rating agencies look at? So they look at this, as I mentioned, but they also look at your economy, and they look at your structurally balanced budget, because you do operate, obviously, in a balanced budget. That's why you have surplus. If you didn't, okay. And that'd be a big negative if you didn't, but you do. But what we want to do is to create excess cash flow in the form of this policy, so that if indeed and when, because it's going to happen again, we just don't know when a slowdown occurs or recession occurs or big taxpayers move away from the city, whether it's here or Roanoke had it happen, it's going to happen. We are prepared as much as possible to meet what we don't like, which is a slowdown or negative with regard to revenues to meet our payrolls. So the 15% is being recommended. Let's go to page 4. Rather than give you this information in a vacuum, we wanted to give it to you comparatively, and that's what you're going to see up here on the screen. So we lumped them together in the form of, on the left-hand side, dollars, on the right-hand side, percentage. I would argue that the percentage is more important, of course, because again, some places, such as Virginia Beach, is much larger than you, okay? Some places like Abingdon, much smaller than you. So again, but you just get a sense of, though, where these folks that are AAA rated, that's the first tier, what their just sheer dollars are versus yours, what the AA1s, that's the highest, and what the AA2s look like and the AA3s. So we just wanted to give a sense of all that. On the right-hand side, you could see your city policy. And what you notice on the city policies, it really doesn't matter if it's AA, 1, 2, or 3, or AAA. You're kind of at the lower end. Everybody seems to be, almost everybody, eclipsing you. That's sort of the visual of that. But if you move it to 15%, you see there, especially the AA2s, where you are with Moody's, you're much more in line. AA1s, you're very strong. And AA3s, I mean, the AAAs, as you expect, again, most are going to be a little better than you are, as you'd expect. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So you can see it. Yes, sir.
So other cities are eclipsing us, but what are their, this shows it as a percentage of their revenue. It's
Right.
not showing their policy necessarily.
Right, not their policy, but you see what they are, what they look like, yes. So again, my point is that if we move to 15%, we're going to be right in the thick of all these really good credits, meaning all these are highly rated Virginia localities. And that's what you should be, you're a top city, you should look like that in your ratios. Okay, so that's our thinking. Now, go to page 5. We did this in the form of medians, and what we changed here was we wanted you to also see national medians. Not really as helpful. You'll notice that you're really much more in the thick of, and how you compare to Virginia medians versus national. And for the reason for that is we are a unique state. We are, as best as we know, the only state in the country where cities and counties don't overlap. So a lot of these medians nationally are really different bases. So Virginia typically looks different And that's why we spend, and the rating agencies understand that, why we spend so much time drilling comparatives to Virginia versus like a North Carolina or a Maryland. It's really not apples and apples. And that's just a point we just want you to see there, okay? All right. So our observations and all that, sorry. On page 6, I really kind of said all this. So what is our recommendation on page 7? And that is this. We'd like to recommend that you consider amending your policy, that you move from 10% to 15% and get there over the next 5 years. To the extent that you can get there quicker and sustain it, all the better. All right, you mentioned extra dollars this year. Maybe that moves it up a little faster. But it's also possible recession hits, things happen. We don't want to do something that's not realistic and it's not thinking about that. So we recommend that we move it in such a way that year to year, we try to put roughly the equivalent of 1%, but we don't make it in the policy saying this year's 10, next year's 11, following year's 12. We don't recommend doing that. We just say that it's part of your overall budget discussions each year that where possible and where prudent, you try to move towards that. And again, maybe this is the year you may go a whole percent or 1.5% versus the equivalent of 1%, or next year, I should say. You know, that's the thinking. But we don't make it rigid. That I think would be overly burdensome to you, and you'd probably, over the next 5 years, kick yourself saying, I wish we didn't do that. But aspirationally, the goal is to be there in 5 years. And that roughly means $1 to $2 million extra dollars a year each year over and above where you are in today's dollars. Because again, the budgets keep evolving and growing. So that's what we're thinking about. I think a couple points on page 8. This itself will not make you AAA, will not get you higher by Moody's. However, Moody's report, which is available, as you know, on your website, y'all, for everyone, citizens, all those reports that we're talking about, Moody's does say, and they're the ones that have you at 2 notches away. They say right here, and I've got the report. I said factors that could lead to an upgrade. Increased reserve levels, that's their first point. Reduction in debt burden, okay, that's not moving in that direction. You're basically about level, okay. Factors that lead to a downgrade. Sizable decline in the tax base, reduction in reserves. So that's what they're telling you. So again, we think this is moving in the right direction, builds extra cushion for what inevitably will be a rainy day. Don't know when, but inevitably. And so that is our recommendation. I don't know if you want to add anything, Donna, or to that. That's what I was going to say.
We've started talking about this more, and I know in our last, for the 2020 budget, council had, I know you all had a number of thoughts when we talked about what to do with the money that came back from schools and if we should be trying to increase our fund balance or not. And that's one reason we typically look at those policies every couple of years. David and I had this discussion to make sure that I don't want to box us in. And for every 0.5% that we grow our fund balance based on our current revenues, it's about $1 million in addition we would be setting aside. That's not an easy task. So it would have to become council priority as we balance the budget and look at everything else, our competing services, our competing demands, projects that need to be built. I mean, all of that has to come together. But it would have to be a council priority to start setting more money aside. GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, we typically look at their best practices. And their best practice for unassigned fund balance is you should have at least 2 months of expenses set aside so that if there's a natural disaster, downturn in the economy, something happens that you're, oh shoot, that you have at least those 2 months' expenses set aside. That would be 16% for us. So that's why we kind of ended up towards this 15%. But I will sit here and tell you, I can't do that in 2021. I mean, I can't. I would have to find $10 million and sit here and tell you, this is what we're going to do. And I can't do that. That would be near impossible. Because, as a locality, all of our goals are to provide excellent services. And that would be like cutting out a large department. I mean, I don't have a way to do that. So that's when we talked about what would make more sense is to try to grow this over a 5-year period, the goal of 15%, but looking at our revenue growth as well. So if we're in a year that, we feel like there's a downturn, or we're looking at our revenues and the growth is not there, then that would be a year that I don't think we should try to grow that fund balance. So it's going to have to be on an annual basis as you look at this, but it's got to be a priority of council. You all have always supported our financial policies. You've always been right there behind me, and I really appreciate that. But this is something we'd have to do together as well.
I'm sorry.
And we're not looking for an answer today.
Yes, we're not, right?
But at that December 10th meeting, when if we move forward with this bond issue and we have a public hearing, we would like to have something a little more concrete to show the rating agencies that we have changed our fund balance policy and to make it more stronger. And we would like to have that with this bond issue. So that's kind of what we're looking at and thinking about our timing.
Sorry, remind us of that date?
December 10th, we have one meeting in December.
Vice Mayor Dolan has a question.
So I'm wondering how reasonable or how attainable this is, given all the needs that our city has at the current time, and if it would be possible to do less over a longer period of time, or is the 5 years, is that the drop dead?
There's no absolutes, no, but I think more than just a 5-year, you do your 5-year CIP, and I think sort of one, dovetails with the other, and 5 years is, basically viewed as a kind of a outer limits of some time frame or something like that, to be honest. But not absolute.
I mean, it makes sense to do something.
Right.
I'm not disputing that at all. I mean, you've made a fantastic case.
Well, and I would like to write the policy or suggest the policy to put before you that if we don't make it to 15% in 5 years, we're not necessarily out of compliance with our policy.
was my other-
I don't want to box us in, but I do want to be a strong enough policy to show the rating agencies, we're really working on this, we're making it a priority, but it's got to happen a little at a time. Because you're right, I mean,
So if we set
It's a
15
lot.
and don't make 15, is that held against us in a negative way, or?
I think to some extent, 5 years is 5 years, so they'll see the trend and what you've done. But I know enough about your staff as it is right now, as it's constituted, and I really believe that if this was to be put in the way that Don is talking about it, if I was a betting man, I'm not per se, but I bet you're going to get there in 5 years. But, as she said, if there is really a big recession, is something that happens, fine. We're talking to the rating agencies, we say it's aspirational. That's what it is. We're saying to them that we're not just beating our chest going, we made 10%, that's the end all and be all. What we're really saying is we really want to be at 15%, and we're trying to make some conscious decisions while the economy's good to move towards that. I think that's what this is worth.
well, and it's also very positive that we typically end the year at 15% because we do budget conservatively. So our revenues are exceeding our expenditures. We're putting that money in unassigned fund balance. So as you saw those numbers, we're ending our fiscal year typically at 15% or better. So we know that money is available, but the way our policy's written, that money goes into one-time expenditures, typically pay-as-you-go capital. So there can be a tweak there that more money stays in unassigned fund balance from the end of the year, and that helps us have that going forward. So it is, just like Councilman Nelson said, we can look at holding some of that in unassigned fund balance for future funding or helping grow our unassigned fund balance. We've got some options, but that's why I think it's important to not box ourselves in.
Well, and I think it makes sense from a financial security standpoint, not just the rating.
Yes.
That's right.
Thank you.
Councilmember Nelson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Again, Mr. Rose, thank you, and Donna likewise. This past spring, we had some very well-intended, good conversation when we were faced with the possibility of having some reserves that we could have put toward the fund balance and increasing it above the 10%. And then we had some other significant community needs that were equally compelling. And in that conversation, it was mentioned that when the rating agencies look at a city, they don't just look at the pure amount of funds on the balance sheet. They look at the other amenities and the provisions that a city uses to address the needs of its citizens, lower the poverty rate, improve the infrastructure, and so forth. I don't know if any of us really had a definitive confirmation as to whether that was true or not. Can you shed any insights on whether those intangible factors come into play when determining a credit rating, or is it just a pure balance sheet
No, I
financial?
tell you what, I think you've said it very, very well. That's exactly the former, not the latter,
Right.
that you were talking about, is how the rating agencies look at this. They look at, if it were just purely by numbers, we could tell you, here, do this, and it's formulaic. It's not. What it is, as I started to say earlier, it was unassigned fund balance is one of the biggest, maybe the biggest criteria, but then also what you just said, which is the quality of life. What are you doing to make the quality of life? What are you doing to shrink the poverty level? What are you doing to make this a place that people want to come to sustain things? And are you investing in the community? So some people ask me sometimes, the local governments will say, well, if we have zero debt, will we be AAA? And the answer is almost never, because zero debt typically means you're not investing in your community, you're not doing generational projects. Now, if you have way too much debt, that'll be a negative as well. That's not your situation. So I couldn't answer your question any better than what you stated it, really. It's all those factors that you have, your recall from the spring is right on. This is an important one, and this is one that we're able to at least quantify in terms of sheer dollars. But you know better than I ever could, because I don't live here, that if you make certain critical investments, that's going to be like seeds that they're going to grow for things that you care about, and that's critical as well. So the rating agencies look at all of those, and typically it's 4 components that the rating agencies look at. Number one, not in this order, mind you, but let's just go it. Number one, demographics. That means the overall economy / the size of your area. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? What's the unemployment? A variety of things fall into the world of demographics. That's one component. Second component is what we call finances, meaning do you operate in a structurally balanced budget or not? Simply put, how is your tax rate in line with your neighbors? That kind of thing, finances. Third is your debt. How much debt do you have? Is it under control? Is it out of control? Is it just, is it going upward like this? Or is it like your policies? It's staying basically flat for the foreseeable future. They like that. That's debt. And then the fourth is basically your overall, your fund balances. You know, what you really have in terms of dollars there. And then each within them, there's different, little tentacles of things that matter within all of those 4 basically components, if you would.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rose. I appreciate that answer. It tells us we need to focus on everything.
Don't fall asleep.
That's why your meetings last so long. You got to get all those things done. Yes, sir.
Councilmember Wright?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Rose, for coming. Can you, for folks at home, can you expand on the benefits of a AAA rating? So presumably lower borrowing rates, but what
Sure.
else?
So a AAA rating, basically, well, let me say this before I say that was right. The rating category that you're in right now, that and the AAA, the AA, AAA categories really are the gold standard for local governments. Now, a lot of local governments will perhaps never get to AAA because of certain things that AAAs typically require. One of those is a certain sheer population size or certain other unique demographics. One of those, for example, that Charlottesville has a AAA rating. It's not that large, Charlottesville itself versus Albemarle County, but the university is there, okay? Williamsburg has William and Mary there. So those are viewed and have been there for generations. That's helpful to those places, okay? Now, coming back to what you said, to have a AAA or a AA plus range that you have basically sends a message that not only are investors going to pay up, meaning they're not going to be able to have particularly higher interest rates than the market, they're going to probably take a little lower than the average in the market because you're so highly rated. If they want to own your bonds, they know your likelihood of default is essentially none. The second thing, what I think this really does, aside from that, is it's really helpful for economic development. It's helpful for existing businesses that are here that are thinking about expanding, as opposed to not just also other businesses from outside thinking of coming in. What a AAA, AA range that you've got says is that you are structurally balanced, you're well managed, you're able to handle things, you're investing in yourself. Now, are there an outlier example or two? Sure, I'm sure we can all find one. But by and large, with the scrutiny these rating agencies do, and by the way, if we were, for some reason, not to borrow money for the next 5 years, not realistic, but if we weren't, they still are going to review us every year. That's the way they've evolved to. So it's not as if we get a holiday from them. They're going to review us constantly. That's called surveillance. So having said that, I really think that you're putting yourself in as good a position as possible for the economic development component of all this. And that's what I would say. I'm happy to expand on it, but that's just the things
That's
I'd say.
okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Para?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I didn't know that about economic development and the AAA bonds. That's quite, or the AAA rating and economic development. That's very interesting. Also, what you said about the size of the locality. Of course, we've got a growing university that doesn't have the track record of William and Mary or University of Virginia, but maybe at some point it would help us out.
Absolutely.
In the
And
far,
absolutely.
hopefully not too terribly distant future.
Right.
So I was really pleased to hear this presentation because it affirmed what several of us were saying during the budget hearing. Certainly, Councilmember Hegelson was saying we needed to save more money and put more money aside. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I feel certain he'd be beating the drum pretty loudly right now if he were here. And Councilmember Nelson, I was trying to merge the two, was saying very similar things. We need to do this. 10%. Is what you've told us is basically the bare minimum that we should be considering. I think 16% is good. I think 20% would be the aspirational goal based on what I've seen in the trends in the AAA ratings. I'd like to have a AAA rating. And Madam Mayor, you said that you'd like to see a AAA rating. I think that's what you said. I think going to 20% would be the way to help get there. It's not going to be the end-all be-all, as you just pointed out, and I certainly, based on what Ms. Witt said, don't think that's doable in 5 years. I think that's more of a longer range goal. If we want to be AAA, I think we'll probably need to get in that direction. I certainly think 15% is the way to go. I think, and council does need to make this a priority. It's been several of our priorities over the past years, but we need to actually buckle down and do this. A couple of questions that I'm unsure of, policy versus actual data. So if we are actually posting about 15%, plus or minus, but our policy says 10%, are the agencies looking at what we have done and what our history is? I imagine they're probably looking at everything. Or are they looking at our policy itself and saying, oh, you know, they're going to go by the minimums and they just happen to be doing better than that?
Well, I would say this. Number one, if the policy is amended, they will take some comfort in knowing that if you continue to be closer to 15%, you're much less likely to strip out the difference between 10% and 15%. Think of it this way. Right now, your policy says 10%. And one of the questions they always ask Donna is, okay, you're going to end up this year above 15%. Is there any plans to use the overage? And that starts to get them a little uncomfortable if you start to say, well, yeah, I've got 5 extra percentage points and I can use all of it. Whereas then they say, well, I notice you're not going to be planning to use all of it or maybe any of it because you're trying to build to 15% consistently with the cushions. So I just think this will move you in the right direction. It will help, and it will give them the comfort when Donna gives them an answer that we want to have, which is we're moving towards a better level, a higher level, with council support.
Okay, all right, well, I certainly think we need to do this, and, all right, so I see the current unassigned fund policy listed on page 2, the recommendation is on page 7, is it? Yes, 7. All right, so I would suggest that Ms. Witt, that you will work up some language to amend the policy as to what it may be for council's approval, the debate and approval at an upcoming meeting. But I would certainly want to see an amended policy moving forward so we can start moving in the right direction. I like the idea of having a little bit of flexibility built into it, so that if something unforeseen comes up, we're not locked into a certain schedule. I think that's wise counsel. They say that the best time to plant a tree is 50 years ago, and the second best time to plant a tree is now. We should have been doing this several years ago, so let's start doing it now, because we can't go back in the past. So, thank you, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember Wilder.
Again, thank you for the presentation. Again, we really appreciate the information. I really appreciate the comparison on page 4 to other localities, so we can just get a better understanding of where we stand and get a better understanding of the numbers. And I do understand the importance of increasing the fund balance, but I understand also doing it over time. Because the community does have a lot of needs. We've been a growing city, and also we are an old city that has a lot of challenges as well with our schools and infrastructure and that nature. So I do understand the importance of growing it over time, gradually. So I do appreciate that. And also to hear the comments that is not just one particular thing, but a variety of items, especially like with quality of life that we want to have. So I do understand that. So thank you for your presentation, and thank you for the comments here. So.
Thank you, Mr. Wilder. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you again, Mr. Rose, for your presentation. Councilmember Pero is right. I have mentioned over time or during the last conversation that I'm not objecting to potentially raising it either. Ms. Witt brought up an important point, though. What do we cut out? Or what's the department that we decrease? And so that's something that I think maybe, have you seen cities that improve the rating or are in a great position, but they made an investment somewhere that made the difference in the factors that Mr. Nelson was talking about? Because, I look at, we are, as Councilmember Wilder said, a growing city, projected to be about 92,000 in 10 years or so, which is pretty quick. And so that doesn't decrease our service needs. It probably will expand our public safety needs. We've already talked about that. So how do we get here or get to that point, balance it out, as they've said, and then still meet the projected needs we think we might have? Right. And I don't know if there are cities who've done certain or particular investments in one area to get to a certain point that balances out something else. Education, workforce, to decrease the poverty, or, service decrease, putting more onus on the citizens. I don't know, but can we have examples of that?
Well,
Are there?
I think that's why it's important to look at our revenue growth each year as well. Because if our revenues, I mean, if the economy's still growing and things are looking good, it's easier to say, well, you know, our revenues may go 2 or 3%. We can use part of that
Okay,
to increase our unassigned fund balance. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a cut.
okay,
We've got to look at our growth and our revenues, and, you know, it has to all come together.
Okay.
It's not going to be one piece or the other, I don't think.
okay, thank you. Any, Councilmember Pero?
Just like to comment to that, if that's all right. It's very similar to what we talked about in our budget, in our retreat earlier. We have to figure out ways to grow revenues, and I believe that a way to grow revenue is strategically have targeted investments in those areas adjacent to the areas that are experiencing a high rate of growth. I was thinking about this the other day. We were talking about investing in the borders around the central business district because we're seeing such a high rate of growth here. Property values increasing, which is fantastic. So we should be looking at Madison Street. We should also be looking at, and because the investment's there, Lower Rivermont. And probably, hopefully, up on the, let's say, the downriver side of Main Street. What are those border areas surrounding the high growth areas? We just should do the same on Wards Road and other targeted areas of high growth. If we can grow our revenues, specifically our real estate tax income, then that's our primary source of revenue. It would be great dividends. And you said supply and demand tells me that with 92,000 people in the city, that the value of real estate has to increase. Absolutely has to. So we need to make sure that we're investing in a way that to support and hopefully accelerate that increase. But anyway, sorry, that's my philosophical point for the moment.
I will add one point, and kudos to this council and the councils before you. We have had one tick upgrade since I've been finance director, but that's because we've all worked together to make that happen. So I greatly appreciate that in my career.
You talking about ratings?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, next is roll call, and we'll start with Councilmember Nelson. I think I started last time with you.
Thank
but-
you, I do not have any.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Para.
I don't believe I have anything either. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you, Councilmember Wright.
No items, Madam Mayor.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Wilder.
I don't think I have any items, thank you.
All right, Vice Mayor Dolan.
No items, thank you.
All right, well, I'll take up everybody's time for a minute. I have the Star Hill Brewery is opening at 1300 Main Street, formerly Grassroots. The media preview is Thursday, October 24th at 12 p.m. There are also 2 other exciting events happening with an existing business and a new business. So those details and developments will be forthcoming later this week as well. And also, I think we might have sent out a note, but for council members regarding November 26th, which is the holiday, Thanksgiving week, meeting, if there is no business, just to put it on your minds, if you all are okay with canceling that meeting potentially.
I would not object to that whatsoever.
You would not object. All right. Well, we had discussed it. Yeah, we discussed it.
Budget session of the day.
Oh, okay.
All day long?
Maybe change our retreat date? Okay. But if we can, and staff is looking at that, they've talked to some departments, we may be able to not have a meeting on November 26th. So just to make you all aware of that. All right, and thank you, and we are recessed until 7:30.